Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where royal crowns glint by candlelight, velvet drapes stir with unseen drafts, and the echoes of footsteps down cold stone corridors carry whispers that history tried to bury. You're wandering through a palace where the walls have heard confessions never meant for the daylight, where kings who ruled nations also guarded desires too dangerous to speak aloud. And yes, tonight you're going to hear those secrets, though you probably won't survive this bedtime story without raising your eyebrows at least once. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know your location and the local time in the comments below. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You picture yourself moving deeper into the royal corridors, brushing your hand across the stone, cool and rough, each groove cut by masons centuries ago. The air is heavy with the scent of burning tallow candles, a little bitter, mixed with the faint sweetness of wine spilled in haste. You aren't alone. Behind these doors, kings sit on thrones gilded in power, yet even their most shining crowns could not shield them from desire, scandal, and whispers of forbidden love. Your first guide into this hidden history is Edward II, a man whose reign became a battlefield between affection and authority. You find yourself standing in the Great Hall of Westminster, where the fire roars and courtiers huddle, murmuring in russet cloaks and saffron tunics. At the center, the king himself reclines with a presence both regal and strangely vulnerable. And near him, never far from his side, stands a figure who doesn't quite blend in. Piers Gaveston, his closest companion, his trusted favorite, and, many said, much more. You notice the way Edward's eyes track him across the chamber, a glance too long, a smile too private. Scholars still argue whether what bound them was simply an intense medieval friendship, or something richer, something physical, something dangerous in an age where enemies lurked at every corner. But to you, walking unseen among the crowd, the tension feels unmistakable. There's an intimacy here, wove the odd detail that catches you. Gaveston bold enough to wear jewels that mirrored the king's own, a gesture of closeness, almost mocking the hierarchy of court. It wasn't just love or favoritism, it was a spectacle, and to Edward's lords, a humiliation. You follow Edward into quieter chambers later that night, where voices drop low. The king leans close to Gaveston, words soft, laughter muffled into shadows. The world shrinks to two men sharing confidences, as if the weight of a crown had vanished, as if armies and treaties could wait until morning. For Edward, moments like these were both a sanctuary and a danger. He could not hide them from everyone, and perhaps he never wanted to. Desire has a way of daring, of slipping past locked doors and iron laws. But desire, when tied to power, sparks enemies. Whispers of sodomy began to coil around Edward's throne, sharpened by nobles who despised Gaveston's influence. The word was a weapon, more political than moral, yet it clung like smoke, and you, wandering through these candlelit halls, can hear it in the way courtiers hiss to each other, the venom tucked into their smiles, the envy that feeds their outrage. Scholars still debate whether Edward and Gaveston's bond crossed into romance or remained bound by loyalty, yet to the medieval mind, even the suspicion was enough. You feel the weight of that judgment pressing down like a storm brewing beyond the walls. Kings may rule with swords and seals, but their hearts, when exposed, could undo them faster than any army. You drift toward the tall windows, moonlight spilling in silver streaks over the floor. Outside, London is restless, its streets alive with taverns and murmurs. Inside, the king laughs softly with his companion. Unaware, or perhaps unwilling to care, that history is already writing its footnotes in scandal. For you, it's a haunting reminder. Power cannot silence longing, and longing cannot always be hidden from power. And so the story begins, with Edward II and the dangerous warmth of Gaveston's presence, setting the stage for a kingdom where affection became treason, and love was both a crown and a chain. You slip further into Edward II's world, following the soft shuffle of velvet shoes across flagstones, the murmur of voices fading as you draw closer to the heart of his scandal, the bond between a king and his chosen favorite, Piers Gaveston. The court is restless tonight, you can sense it. Nobles line the long hall, their russet and indigo cloaks brushing against each other, the air thick with the mingling scents of roasted venison and spiced wine. Yet the focus isn't on the feast, nor the tapestries that glimmer with shell-gold threads. It's on two men at the high table. Edward leans toward Gaveston with an ease that feels too casual, too intimate. His laughter rings sharper than the clash of goblets, and every eye in the hall narrows with judgment. You catch a glance between them, quick, daring, a flicker of warmth that doesn't belong in the cold machinery of monarchy. Scholars still argue whether Edward's affection for Gaveston was romantic, platonic, or simply an intense brotherhood. Yet here, standing among fur-draped lords, you feel the tension. It isn't about what happens behind closed doors. It's about what everyone thinks they see. Edward makes no effort to hide his favoritism. Gaveston, once a minor Gascon knight, now parades in saffron-dyed silks, wearing a jeweled belt that gleams too brightly for someone of his station. The odd detail, you notice, he even dares to mimic Edward's attire, as if reflecting the king's image. Nobles murmur, their whispers sharp as knives. A king should not be mirrored, only obeyed. You drift closer to the dais, catching Gaveston's smug grin as he mocks an earl across the hall. The insult draws a ripple of laughter from Edward. But the noble's jaw tightens. You realize that this isn't just about love, it's about humiliation. Every gift Edward lavishes on Gaveston, every title, every land grant, is a slap to the faces of men who believe power belongs to bloodlines, not affection. The tension builds like a storm. Behind the polished masks of courtesy, you hear words muttered under breath. Sodomy, disgrace, unfit for a king. In medieval courts, those words were daggers, meant not to expose truth, but to wound reputation. Edward's heart has become his vulnerability, and you can almost feel the noose tightening. Later, you follow the king and his favorite into a more private chamber, where torchlight flickers against carved oak. Edward leans close, his voice soft, almost childlike, confiding fears and hopes into Gaveston's ear. The intimacy is undeniable, not just in what is spoken, but in what is unspoken. For a moment, you almost forget the crown, the nobles, the politics. You see simply two men, bound by affection, in a world that refuses to understand it. But the world outside those doors is not so forgiving. You hear the nobles plotting, their whispers carried through corridors like smoke. They speak not only of rebellion, but of removal. How to strip the king of his dangerous favorite. Scholars still debate whether the nobles hated Gaveston more for who he was to Edward, or for the power he wielded because of it. Either way, the result is the same. Gaveston's fate is sealed by envy as much as by rumor. The halls grow colder. You watch as Edward tries again and again to bring Gaveston back after exile, defying every demand of his barons. Each recall is a love letter written in royal decree, a refusal to let go. And yet, each time, the backlash grows louder, harsher. The crown may be Edward's, but the leash is tightening, pulled by men who see his heart as weakness. The oddest moment comes when you hear how Gaveston, even in exile, styled himself with titles meant to sting the nobility, mocking their grandeur while basking in Edward's devotion. You picture him smirking, as if he knew he was untouchable, at least while the king's love protected him. But protection is fragile, and love, when weaponized, can destroy more than it saves. You wander through these chambers with unease, sensing the inevitable. A crown can shield a man from armies, but not from betrayal, not from the whispers that erode loyalty like dripping water on stone. Edward II's bond with Gaveston is not just a romance. It is a scandal unraveling into tragedy. One glance, one smile, one jest too many. And as the candles gutter low, the whispers grow louder still. A favorite too bold, a king too blinded by affection, and a court sharpening its knives in the shadows. You move deeper into Edward II's shadowed reign, tracing the echoes of mourning bells that toll after Gaveston's fall. The laughter that once warmed the king's halls is gone, replaced by the heady silence of grief. You find Edward pacing in his chamber, saffron curtains pulled close, his eyes red-rimmed and sleepless. He clutches a small token, perhaps a ring, perhaps a piece of cloth, that once belonged to Gaveston, as though it could tether him to the past. The court pretends to move on, but you feel the raw edges of Edward's pain in every decision he makes. His lords whisper that he is unfit to rule, more concerned with private sorrow than public duty. You sense the truth. Edward's grief is not private at all. It bleeds into the kingdom, a wound that refuses to close. Yet love, like history, has its way of repeating. You notice another figure slowly drawing near to Edward's orbit, a man whose presence softens the king's sorrow. Hugh Despenser the Younger, ambitious, sharp-eyed, draped in indigo and teal, his jeweled fingers resting too comfortably on the arms of Edward's throne. At first, the courtiers dismiss him as another favorite, a mere replacement to fill the void Gaveston left. But you can see it in the way Edward leans in when Despenser speaks, in the faint curl of a smile returning to his lips. The king is alive again, if only because someone else is willing to share his grief. Scholars still argue whether Edward's bond with Despenser was a mirror of his love for Gaveston, or whether it burned even brighter, more political, more dangerous, more consuming. And it is dangerous. Despenser is not content to bask in the king's affection. He reaches for more. Lands, titles, power, all flow toward him like a river diverted from its rightful course. Nobles grit their teeth as ancient estates are stripped away and gifted to this new companion. You watch as anger simmers, rising hotter than it ever did with Gaveston. If Gaveston mocked them, Despenser robs them. The odd detail that sticks with you, Despenser begins to wear the spoils of his gains openly. Rings once belonging to noble houses now gleam on his hands. Estates that should echo with old family names resound instead with his own. You can almost hear the lords grind their teeth in unison. Edward, blinded by devotion, defends Despenser as fiercely as he once defended Gaveston. You sense the repetition, the cycle of love turned to scandal, scandal turned to rebellion. The barons, once again, gather in smoky chambers, muttering of treason and tyranny. The Despensers, father and son, bound together, become the villains of every whispered story. And then, like a spark in dry tinder, rebellion ignites. Nobles rise in arms, banners snapping in the wind, their voices united against the grip Despenser has over the king. The kingdom fractures, loyalty shatters, and Edward stands alone, shield raised not against foreign invaders, but against his own people. You wander through battlefields littered with broken shields, the night air thick with the acrid tang of smoke. Scholars still argue whether Edward's downfall was written in his affections or in his failures as a ruler. Perhaps both are true. What you see is a man who cannot separate heart from crown, who tries to rule with love where others demand iron. And the price is steep. The oddest image surfaces as you drift further into his final years. Edward and Despenser attempting to flee by sea, the king disguised in shabby robes, the waves crashing against their small vessel. For a moment, they are not monarch and favorite, but fugitives bound by desperation. Yet the sea does not carry them to safety. Capture follows, and with it, humiliation. You watch as Edward is imprisoned, his crown stripped, his body weakened, his dignity reduced to a pawn in greater games of power. Despenser's fate is worse, public, brutal, unforgettable. His execution is a spectacle meant to erase him, yet it only etches his name deeper into the story. Edward's end is whispered, shrouded in shadows and legend. Scholars still debate the truth, whether he was murdered with cruelty unspeakable, or whether he lingered in obscurity, fading away forgotten. What is certain is that his heart, worn too openly, too defiantly, became both his solace and his ruin. You stand in the quiet of his abandoned chamber, the saffron curtains now moth-eaten, the token of Gaveston long vanished. What remains is the echo of a man who loved too openly in a world that demanded silence. And as you drift from Edward's story, you feel the weight of his tragedy press against your own chest, reminding you that history never forgets, even when it tries to hide. You slip through time, into the gilded corridors of Westminster, where a new ruler takes the throne and Edward II's shadow lingers like a ghost. The crown now rests on the brow of Richard II, a boy king who grows into a man both dazzling and dangerous. You watch him, robed in indigo velvet, trimmed with gold, a peacock among sparrows. His court becomes a theater of spectacle, where pageantry is power and loyalty is measured in silk and silver. Richard does not ride out to war like his ancestors. Instead, he surrounds himself with companions who flatter, charm, and elevate his sense of divine right. One figure in particular draws your gaze: Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford. Tall, proud, and striking in russet and teal, de Vere becomes more than just a courtier. He is Richard's confidant, hunting partner, perhaps something more. The whispers start quietly, spreading like smoke through the court. The king spends nights in de Vere's chambers, the two inseparable in both politics and pleasure. You notice the way Richard looks at him, eyes softened in a rare tenderness that cuts through his usual imperious glare. Scholars still argue whether their intimacy was friendship gilded with rumor, or whether it was something unspoken yet undeniable. Oddly enough, Richard's devotion manifests not in whispered secrets, but in grand displays. He grants de Vere titles with a lavish hand, culminating in the creation of the Duke of Ireland, a dignity so high, so sudden, that nobles choke on their own outrage. You can almost hear their protests echoing across the halls. How can one man, of modest birth and little renown, be raised above houses that have served for centuries? And Richard, ever theatrical, defends his favorite not with humility, but with arrogance. He stages banquets where de Vere sits at his side, dripping with jewels gifted from the crown itself. He commands musicians to play for them late into the night, the melodies curling through candlelit chambers like sighs of forbidden affection. You wander through one such feast, watching de Vere's hand rest too casually on Richard's shoulder as the king laughs at a joke no one else dares to make. The courtiers exchange glances, their faces masks of polite disdain. You feel the tension humming beneath the surface, like a bowstring pulled too taut. Mainstream history records the noble's eventual fury, the lord's appellant, a faction of powerful peers, rise in defiance. They see de Vere not as a companion, but as a corrupting influence, a parasite draining the kingdom. Their rebellion is fueled not only by politics, but by the scandal of intimacy, too visible, too unsettling for their rigid order. And yet, in this moment, you see Richard unrepentant. He sends De Vere to muster forces against the rebels, granting him command of armies. But fate is fickle, and De Vere, unseasoned in war, falters. His troops scatter, his cause collapses, and he flees across the sea, exiled to a life of fading glory and whispered infamy. The oddest detail you catch is Richard's reaction when news of De Vere's death reaches him years later. Killed by a wild boar while hunting in exile, the king reportedly weeps, overcome with grief that seems too raw, too unkingly for men of his stature. Imagine it, the most powerful man in England, undone not by battle or politics, but by the memory of a lost companion, devoured in the woods of a foreign land. You linger in that image, the king pacing in saffron robes, his crown abandoned on a table nearby, as he whispers the name of the one who once shared his heart. It is a quiet moment, stripped of grandeur, and yet it feels more real than the coronations, the councils, the rebellions. Scholars still debate whether Richard's downfall, his deposition by Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV, was caused by his extravagance, his tyrannical tendencies, or by the resentment sparked by his unrestrained devotion to men like De Vere. Perhaps it was all three, tangled together like threads of a tapestry too bright to endure. As you drift away from Richard's court, you carry with you the scent of crushed roses and candle smoke, the sound of music played for an audience of two, and the knowledge that love, whether whispered in shadows or flaunted in gold, always leaves its mark on history. You wander now into the reign of James I, the first Stuart King of England, who strides onto the stage of history with a crown that links Scotland and England under one throne. The year is 1603, and London greets him with trumpets and banners. But your attention drifts past the fanfare toward the subtle drama unfolding within his private chambers. James is not a figure of silent restraint. He is verbose, witty, fond of scholars and poets, and most notably, open in his affections for certain men who rise in his favor. Unlike Edward II or Richard II, James does not bother cloaking his attachments in shadow. You watch him in his indigo doublet embroidered with saffron thread, leaning too close to a young favorite, his laughter spilling across the hall like wine. One name becomes impossible to ignore: Robert Carr, a handsome courtier with auburn hair and striking eyes. Carr quite literally falls into James's world during a jousting tournament. You see it vividly. The horse rears, Carr tumbles, and the king himself rushes forward, fussing over the injured youth. That single accident shifts the tides of courtly life. Within months, Carr is the new star, a man plucked from obscurity and dressed in silks by royal decree. Mainstream history records that James elevated Carr to the title of Viscount Rochester, showering him with estates and wealth. Oddly enough, Carr's handwriting was so poor that his letters often had to be dictated, a detail whispered by secretaries who found themselves writing down royal desires disguised as official orders. Scholars still argue whether James's affection was fatherly, fraternal, or romantic, but the intensity is plain in the documents. The king's endearments to Carr border on the language of lovers. But Carr's star burns too bright, and soon scandal follows. You hear court gossip hissing like wind through stone corridors. Carr entangled in a marriage with Frances Howard, a woman whose family has its own ruthless ambitions. When her first marriage is annulled under suspicious circumstances, whispers of witchcraft, poison, and bribery swirl like smoke. Eventually, both Carr and Frances are tried for murder, the infamous Overbury affair. You catch a glimpse of James, pacing in his saffron slippers, torn between the justice his crown demands and the loyalty his heart still feels. As Carr's fall echoes through the court, another figure steps into the light. George Villiers, later the Duke of Buckingham. Sleek, confident, radiant in teal velvet, Villiers becomes James's new favorite, and perhaps his truest companion. The king is smitten, calling him "my sweet child and wife," in letters that historians pore over with fascination and unease. You can almost hear James's voice softening as he addresses Villiers in private, a tone entirely absent from his blustery public speeches. And yet, this intimacy is not hidden. James parades Villiers openly, allowing him to sit beside him during councils, to accompany him into bedchambers where only kings are meant to sleep alone. Courtiers grind their teeth at the brazenness, muttering prayers under their breath for a monarchy that seems increasingly ruled by love rather than law. The oddest detail you notice is how James, deeply religious and fond of quoting scripture, found ways to justify his devotion. He compared himself to biblical kings who loved deeply and fiercely, framing his attachment not as sin, but as divine. His sermons and writings often bent to this defense, as though the crown itself gave him permission to love as he pleased. Scholars still debate how far these affections went in physical terms, but what is undeniable is their political weight. Villiers rose higher and higher, controlling appointments, influencing foreign policy, shaping the very direction of the Stuart monarchy. You see his hand resting lightly on James's arm during an audience, an innocent gesture that masks the invisible strings of power tugging across the kingdom. And when James finally dies in 1625, you see Villiers weeping at his side, the glittering court momentarily silenced by raw grief. It is a quiet scene, yet it hums with the knowledge that the bond between them, whether of passion, politics, or both, was one that even death could not untangle. As you drift from this chapter, you can almost hear James's words echoing across time. "I am your king, and I will love whom I will." And whether whispered in secrecy or shouted through gilded halls, that defiance is carved into the bones of England's history. The next scene drifts into the reign of Charles II, the Restoration King who returns to London with a court hungry for pleasure after years of Puritan austerity. You step into the glittering ballrooms of Whitehall, where candles burn so brightly they almost rival the stars, and every mirror reflects 1,000 flickering images of velvet, lace, and powdered wigs. Charles moves through it all with a smile that is both roguish and commanding, a king who understands that charm can rule hearts as easily as armies. But behind the frivolity lies something deeper, a current of loyalty and intimacy that shapes his court in ways few dare to speak aloud. You notice the young Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers' namesake, in your imagination, gliding beside the king, a smile too knowing, eyes too observant. Scholars still argue whether Charles's attachments were purely platonic or flirted with romance, but the closeness is undeniable. They share whispered jokes, lean together in public, and exchange subtle touches that scandalous tongues never miss. The odd detail catches your attention. During a masque, Charles personally arranges for his favorite to perform in a role traditionally reserved for the king himself. You imagine the gasps as Villiers struts across the stage, draped in royal purple, and the king laughing from his throne as courtiers sputter in disbelief. It's a power play wrapped in affection, an act of devotion that simultaneously amuses and infuriates the audience. You drift through corridors lined with gilded portraits and hear rumors of other favorites, men whose influence rivals that of ministers. You see Charles confiding secrets in a quiet gallery, leaning close to a companion whose name might not appear in the formal annals of history, but whose presence steers decisions on alliances, appointments, and even the succession itself. Scholars still debate how much of Charles's political maneuvering was informed by affection, by personal loyalty, rather than strategy. Outside the glittering palaces, London hums with the energy of a city reborn. You sense the odd mix of decadence and danger that defines this era. Bawdy taverns, clandestine meetings, and spies hidden in plain sight. Charles navigates this world with his companions close at hand, using charm, intimacy, and sometimes cunning to protect both his crown and the men he favors. The court thrives on spectacle, yet private moments reveal vulnerability. You imagine the king walking alone in the gardens at night, lantern in hand, speaking softly to a favorite whose loyalty has proven unshakable. Their conversation is unrecorded, lost to history, but the air around them is thick with trust, longing, and the unspoken acknowledgement of what they share. Oddly, the king's affection is not limited to companionship. He bestows gifts that astonish and anger the nobility. Estates, positions of authority, and sometimes titles once reserved for hereditary nobles. Courtiers grumble under their breath, jealous and outraged, while Charles watches with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that love and loyalty have their own power, sometimes surpassing law and custom. But danger lurks even in love. Favorites are not immune to betrayal or scandal, and Charles's circle is no exception. Intrigues bubble behind closed doors, plotting against those who rise too high in the royal favor. And yet, despite the threat, the king never abandons those he holds dear. Even as he juggles the pressures of government, foreign diplomacy, and public expectation. You linger in this moment, imagining the soft glow of candlelight reflecting on Charles's face as he listens, laughs, and plans with those closest to him. Scholars still argue whether these attachments were purely personal or calculated tools of political strategy. Yet the truth feels clear to you. Affection in Charles II's court was inseparable from power. And as the night deepens, the palace settles into quiet, broken only by the whisper of silk on marble. You sense the enduring tension of desire and authority, the unrecorded whispers and clandestine touches that history often obscures. Charles II's reign, while celebrated for its spectacle, hides a private world of intimacy and loyalty, a reminder that even kings must navigate the treacherous waters of both love and rule. You drift forward into the shadowed corridors of James II's reign, a king whose life teeters between piety, power, and private indulgence. The year is 1685, and the palace is quiet, the grandeur of Whitehall tempered by the cautious eyes of courtiers who know well the dangers of speaking too freely. James, clad in deep teal and russet, moves with a measured grace, aware that every gesture can ignite rumor and rebellion alike. You watch him in the privacy of his bedchamber, conferring with men whose loyalty is both political and deeply personal. One name emerges repeatedly: Lord Rochester, an elegant, sharp-witted favorite who navigates the court with dexterity, knowing when to bow and when to lean in close to the king. Scholars still argue whether the bond between James and Rochester was rooted in romance, mentorship, or a calculated blend of both, but the closeness is palpable. Oddly enough, James's attachments manifest in peculiar habits. He frequently gifts Rochester rare manuscripts, intricate jewelry, and even commissioned portraits depicting the two of them side by side. You can almost hear the gasps as courtiers whisper. A king so openly devoted, flaunting preference in gold and paint. These gestures, small as they seem, ripple outward, challenging norms and rattling noble sensibilities. You wander the halls as James confides in Rochester on matters of state. The political weight of intimacy is unmistakable. Decisions about alliances, taxation, and appointments are influenced by the man beside him. The duality of affection and authority creates tension, a delicate balance that scholars still debate. Does love cloud judgment, Or can it sharpen loyalty in ways pure strategy never could? The court itself becomes a stage of intrigue. You witness the subtle power struggles. Ministers resent favors granted to the king's companion, while other courtiers attempt to manipulate intimacy to their own ends. Every whispered conversation, every folded hand, every fleeting glance carries meaning, and you realize that James's affections, private though they may be, are inseparable from the machinery of power. The oddest detail lingers in your mind. Rochester, ever aware of the precariousness of favor, keeps a diary with careful coded entries, chronicling both court affairs and intimate moments with the king. You imagine the secret thrill and danger in writing words that, if discovered, could bring ruin. The diary becomes a map of loyalty, desire, and survival, a testament to the hidden lives of men at the highest echelons. As tensions mount, you watch whispers turn to open revolt. Nobles who fear James's Catholic sympathies and his favoritism plot against him, leveraging the scandal of his attachments to weaken support. Affection becomes a double-edged sword, drawing loyalty from some while stoking fury in others. The king's heart, once a source of strength and solace, now threatens to topple his reign. You drift into one of the final moments of this reign, James fleeing Whitehall under the cover of night, cloak pulled tight, the echoes of footsteps trailing behind him. Rochester remains by his side, a silent shadow, witness to both devotion and despair. The crown is lost, but loyalty endures, defying exile and history alike. And as you leave the dimmed chambers, you sense the recurring pattern across these lives. Kings who loved too openly, companions who wielded affection like power, and courts forever roiling with tension, envy, and speculation. Even in retreat, James II's story reminds you that intimacy, though often hidden, shapes history in ways that cannot be erased. You step into the ornate chambers of William III and Mary II, rulers whose union is more political than passionate, yet their court still hums with whispered intrigues of hidden attachments. The late 17th century is alive with ceremony, candlelight reflecting off gilded walls, and the faint scent of beeswax mingling with perfumed silk. You notice the subtle glances exchanged among gentlemen in the corridors, loyal companions whose presence is more than ceremonial, whose influence lingers behind closed doors. William, disciplined and pragmatic, is often distant in public, yet in private he gravitates towards certain confidants with a loyalty that borders on obsession. You see the Duke in teal and indigo, standing just a step behind the king during council meetings, listening closely to both political strategy and the nuances of the monarch's personal preference. Scholars still argue whether William's attentions were strictly platonic, a reflection of camaraderie and trust, or whether private passions colored decisions of state. The odd detail is subtle. William gifts this companion miniature portraits of himself in armor, each painted with meticulous care, each a symbol of favor and trust. These trinkets, seemingly innocent, carry messages of intimacy and influence that are impossible for the court to ignore. Courtiers murmur, eyes darting toward the gifts, speculating on their meaning, while others strategize how to align themselves with the favored courtier. Mary, ever politically astute, observes the delicate balance with her own eyes. She tolerates William's attachments, but subtly maneuvers to ensure her authority is not undermined. You watch her in saffron and russet silk, leaning close to advisors, her gaze never straying from the shifting alliances of the court. Oddly, she seems both amused and wary, recognizing the power that affection wields in the corridors of governance. Publicly, the court thrives on theater. Masked balls, royal processions, and elaborate entertainments designed to dazzle London. Yet behind the glitter, private moments whisper of devotion, loyalty, and possibly desire. You see William confiding in his favored companion in the garden after dusk, the moonlight casting long shadows, their voices low, intimate, unrecorded by history, but palpable in the air. Scholars still debate whether such bonds influenced foreign policy, especially decisions regarding Dutch alliances and naval strategies. The tension of the court is constant. Favorites rise and fall as quickly as the sun, and William's companion must navigate loyalty, ambition, and secrecy with care. You notice the odd habit of coded letters and discreet meetings, a chess game of affection, influence, and survival. It is not merely romance or friendship. It is power, wrapped in trust, danger, and sometimes fear. And yet, the human side persists. You glimpse a quiet evening where William and his confidant share a simple meal, laughter spilling across the room, the weight of crowns momentarily forgotten. These fleeting, tender moments stand in stark contrast to the rigors of governance, reminding you that even kings are guided by the pull of the heart. As you drift from William and Mary's court, you sense that history often underplays the role of personal bonds. Affection, intimacy, and loyalty quietly shape the decisions of rulers, leaving traces in events that seem dictated only by politics and war. The court may bow and observe, but private devotion steers the kingdom in ways that public records rarely capture. You find yourself in the lavish candlelit world of George I, the first Hanoverian king, who crosses the North Sea to claim the English throne in 1714. The palace echoes with the patter of courtiers' shoes on marble floors, their powdered wigs swaying as they whisper rumors that stretch from the throne room to the servants' quarters. George's accent is thick, his manners foreign, yet you notice a keen intelligence and a sharp eye for those who gain his trust, and perhaps his favor. Within the court, men move carefully, aware that proximity to the king carries both privilege and peril. One figure stands out. A young German officer, tall and elegantly dressed in indigo and russet. He earns the king's ear not only through skill in military matters, but through companionship that lingers beyond formal duty. Scholars still debate whether George's attachments were strictly political convenience, personal affection, or a blend of both. But the bond is unmistakable. Oddly, you catch George gifting small, intricate trinkets, a carved box here, a jewel-encrusted dagger there. These gestures are private yet potent, signaling favor in ways words cannot convey. Courtiers speculate endlessly. Is this mere generosity, or does it hint at intimacy that must remain hidden? The answer hovers just out of reach, locked behind the gilded doors of the palace. Public life, meanwhile, demands appearances. Balls, banquets, and state ceremonies fill the days, a glittering dance of loyalty and spectacle. You see George observing his favorite from across the hall, the faintest smile curling his lips as the companion navigates the crowded room with elegance and poise. Every movement, every glance seems loaded with layers of meaning that few outside the inner circle can interpret. In quieter moments, the king confides in his companion in small chambers above the bustling halls. Here, conversation drifts from politics to personal reflection, the difficulties of ruling a foreign land, the loneliness of sovereignty, and perhaps the rare comfort of a sympathetic ear. Scholars still debate how these private bonds may have shaped George's policies, particularly his reliance on advisors and military strategies in Hanover and Britain. The odd detail you notice is George's penchant for secrecy. Letters encoded with symbols, messages hidden in poetry, and gestures visible only to the initiated. Every act of devotion is tempered by caution, a delicate dance between desire and discretion. For the Hanoverians, you imagine George walking in the palace gardens at dusk, with his favorite at his side, their conversation unrecorded but heavy with shared understanding. Even across centuries, these glimpses of tenderness remind you that the human heart persists, even within the confines of power and expectation. As you leave George I's court, the echoes of whispered devotion linger. You sense that history often overlooks the private lives of monarchs. Yet those hidden bonds, whether romantic, platonic, or a mixture of both, shape decisions, alliances, and the very course of a nation. The delicate interplay of affection and authority threads through the crown, leaving traces that remain long after the last candle flickers. You move forward into the reign of George IV, a king whose life is as flamboyant as his wardrobe. The year is 1820, and London dazzles under the glow of gas lamps. Carriages rattling over cobblestones as society gossip swirls like smoke. George, dressed in teal velvet and golden embroidery, strides into his chambers with the confidence of a man who knows the eyes of Europe are upon him. But you quickly sense that the public persona conceals private passions that few dared document. At the center of George's attention is a close companion, a courtier whose presence is both reassuring and influential. Scholars still argue whether George's attachments were romantic, intimate, or the curious mix of ego and affection. But the bond is evident in the way the king seeks counsel, shares laughter, and arranges positions of influence for the man beside him. You notice how George gifts him miniature portraits, fine jewelry, and access to spaces usually reserved for royalty alone, signaling not just trust, but an extraordinary level of devotion. Oddly, George's habits extend to playful displays of attachment. During court balls, he positions his favorite beside him, subtly orchestrating interactions that highlight their closeness. Courtiers murmur, whispers bouncing off gilded walls, but the king seems impervious, enjoying the quiet power that private favor affords. Even the Queen's presence does not deter these subtle gestures, and you sense a complex dance of affection, politics, and public expectation unfolding before you. Behind the scenes, letters travel back and forth between George and his confidant, encoded in the language of familiarity and intimacy. Each word carries multiple layers of meaning, from official matters to personal sentiment, forming a tapestry of connection that the court can only speculate about. Scholars still debate how these bonds influenced policy, appointments, and social maneuvering. Yet the subtle power is unmistakable. The oddest detail is George's obsession with symbolism. Rings, colors, and seating arrangements all communicate messages to the court, a visual language of favor that only insiders fully understand. You can almost hear the quiet laughter of the king as he observes the reactions, delighted by both the loyalty and envy his attention inspires. Despite the pageantry and intrigue, private moments reveal humanity. You picture George walking alone through palace corridors at midnight, lantern in hand, confiding in his companion about loneliness, the weight of the crown, and the joys of genuine connection amidst the performative world of monarchy. These fleeting instances of intimacy provide solace and shape decisions in ways that history's official records often overlook. You also sense the tension between affection and danger. Favorites rise quickly, but the higher they climb, the more precarious their position becomes. George's companion navigates ambition, envy, and expectation with skill, always mindful of the fragility of royal favor, yet their loyalty endures. A testament to the unrecorded power of human connection in the corridors of authority. As your gaze drifts from George IV's gilded chambers, you understand the recurring theme. Kings who loved openly or subtly, companions whose influence swayed courts, and the hidden threads of desire and loyalty that quietly shape history. Even in an era of opulence and scandal, these private bonds leave an indelible mark on the story of England's monarchy, a reminder that affection, once secret, often guides the course of nations. You now wander into the Victorian era, stepping into the shadowed corridors of Queen Victoria's consort, Prince Albert, whose presence defines both love and influence at the heart of the monarchy. Though you notice the subtleties in Edward VII, then Prince of Wales, whose upbringing and later court life are tinged with companionships that were intensely scrutinized. Scholars still argue about the nature of his private attachments, particularly with men at court who became confidants and aides de camp. These relationships often straddle the line between loyalty and intimacy, blurring the distinctions for outsiders, trying to parse history from rumor. The odd detail is how these bonds were codified in gifts and private spaces. Edward, dressed in russet velvet, arranges chambers with favored courtiers in mind, leaving subtle markers of closeness like shared libraries or exclusive seating at dinners. Courtiers, ever alert to signals, note who stands near the prince, who is allowed to speak in private audiences, and who receives tokens of affection or influence. It is a courtly language of power disguised as routine, a choreography of loyalty and secrecy. You drift to Edward's youthful escapades in London's palaces, masked balls, hunting parties, and quiet evenings in candlelit galleries. Here, camaraderie and companionship are inseparable, and gestures that seem casual to outsiders carry meaning only comprehensible to those within the inner circle. Scholars still debate how much these attachments shaped Edward's later policies and diplomatic decisions, but the subtle influence is palpable. Oddly, some favorites maintain diaries and coded letters, a means of preserving the memory of private bonds while shielding them from public scrutiny. You imagine the thrill and risk of composing messages that could betray both affection and influence if discovered. Each word is layered with significance, a reminder of trust, a signal of favor, a subtle claim to proximity to the crown. In public, Edward must perform the role expected of a prince and future king. Yet the tension between performance and private desire is always present. You can almost hear the whispers trailing him through corridors, the envy and speculation of those who notice gestures of intimacy or priority. These unseen dramas ripple through policy, favor, and the subtle distribution of power within the court. You catch glimpses of late-night walks through palace gardens, where the prince and his confidants exchange jokes, concerns, and loyalty. It is in these private moments, away from protocol, that affection takes shape, guiding decisions and forming bonds that are far more durable than any title or decree. Scholars still debate the exact nature of these relationships, but the impact on the court, politics, and historical perception is undeniable. As the evening settles and the lamps dim, you leave Edward's private circle with the sense that monarchy is never solely about public appearances. Intimacy, trust, and secret alliances shape governance, influence policy, and quietly write themselves into the story of a nation. Even as whispers fade, the traces of affection linger, shaping history as much as battles or treaties ever could. You glide into the Edwardian era proper, witnessing Edward VII fully enthroned, his court a swirling spectacle of elegance, fashion, and subtle intrigues. The year is 1901, and London teems with innovation. Carriages giving way to motor cars, yet within the palace walls, ancient codes of conduct dictate behavior. The king moves with confidence, aware of the eyes upon him, yet privately surrounded by companions whose influence is far greater than public acknowledgement allows. Among these figures, you notice a tall, striking courtier in indigo and russet, whose presence commands attention without the need for titles. Scholars still argue about the exact nature of Edward's attachments, particularly with men who serve as advisors, aides, and companions, but their proximity to power is undeniable. The gestures of favor are subtle. Invitations to private dinners, rooms arranged to facilitate proximity, and gifts both luxurious and intimate. These acts, unnoticed by most, create a network of influence that shapes court life and, indirectly, policy. Oddly, Edward thrives on ceremony, yet relies heavily on these trusted companions for grounding. You see him laughing at a joke shared with a confidant in a quiet gallery, far from the public gaze. A moment of humanity amidst the grandeur of monarchy. Scholars debate how much these private bonds affected decision-making, from appointments to diplomatic interactions, but you feel the quiet weight of their influence. The odd detail emerges in the king's penchant for subtle symbolism. Colors, seating arrangements, and private signals communicate favor and devotion, a silent language understood by insiders. Courtiers watch carefully, their expressions a mix of envy, curiosity, and apprehension. You can almost hear the muted murmurs as alliances shift, some motivated by ambition, others by genuine loyalty forged through shared trust and intimacy. Outside the ceremonial halls, Edward and his companions navigate the delicate balance of discretion and visibility. Letters encoded with affection and instruction pass between them, a lifeline of communication, understanding, and influence. Every gesture is deliberate, every conversation layered, a dance of affection intertwined with the machinery of power. Scholars still argue whether these relationships were primarily emotional, strategic, or a blend that served both. You witness fleeting private moments. The king walking through moonlit gardens with a trusted companion, sharing thoughts about the crown, family, and the weight of expectation. The palace corridors echo softly with the shuffle of footsteps. Yet in these shadows, loyalty and affection carve their indelible mark. You imagine the confidant listening, advising, supporting, the bond between them a hidden force shaping the court in ways outsiders rarely perceive. Even as Edward performs for the public, the private network of trust and devotion exerts quiet influence. Men at court rise or fall not merely by merit, but by proximity to favor and the subtle power of attachment. You feel the tension between openness and secrecy, between the allure of intimacy and the danger of exposure. Affection, though concealed, navigates the kingdom alongside politics, fashion, and ceremony. As night falls over London, you linger in the echoing chambers, realizing that history often erases or glosses over these intimate relationships. Yet they persist in quiet gestures, encoded letters, and the loyalty of those who stand closest to kings. Edward VII's court reminds you that even in the height of pomp and ceremony, the human heart, desire, devotion, and secrecy, remains a force that shapes the flow of history in ways both subtle and profound. You drift into the shadowed corridors of George V's court, a world colored by early 20th century pomp, yet still steeped in traditions centuries old. The year is 1910, and the palace hums with the clatter of duties, telegrams, and the whispered secrets of courtiers who move with careful precision. George, now king, walks with a deliberate grace, his expression measured, yet private companions linger near him, shaping moments both personal and political. Among these trusted men, one stands out, a gentleman in deep teal and russet, whose loyalty and discretion are legendary within the palace walls. Scholars still debate the nature of such attachments, particularly in the early decades of the 20th century, when discretion was paramount and scandal could destabilize both monarchy and public perception. Yet the presence of these confidants is unmistakable. Their influence subtly guiding appointments, social engagements, and the king's personal life. Oddly, George has a habit of creating small, private spaces where he can retreat with his companions. A study lined with rare manuscripts, a garden alcove hidden from public view. These are sanctuaries where humor, conversation, and counsel flow freely, and where gestures of trust and affection are exchanged quietly, away from the eyes of courtiers and citizens alike. Scholars still argue whether these bonds affected foreign policy decisions, though the subtle impact seems likely when trusted voices are consistently close at hand. You notice symbolic acts throughout the palace: favors distributed, seating arrangements carefully orchestrated, gifts presented with quiet significance. Every gesture is layered, a language of power and attachment that requires an intimate understanding to interpret. Courtiers watch and speculate, noting which companions receive attention, which smiles linger, and which words carry weight beyond their surface meaning. Even in public, George maintains the delicate balance between decorum and private preference. A dinner, a carriage ride, or a ceremonial procession becomes a stage where subtle signals of favor and loyalty are communicated. These moments, fleeting yet potent, reinforce the hierarchy of trust, influence, and attachment that underpins the monarchy's inner workings. Oddly, letters exchanged with companions are often encoded or metaphorical, a measure of security and intimacy. You imagine the thrill and the risk inherent in composing words that could reveal affection or influence if intercepted. These documents form a hidden map of loyalty, devotion, and unrecorded power, offering scholars tantalizing glimpses into a private dimension of the king's life. You witness a rare evening stroll in the palace gardens, where George and his companion converse under the muted light of gas lamps. Topics range from mundane palace affairs to personal confidences, their bond unspoken yet palpable. The quiet intimacy contrasts sharply with the regimented public life, revealing how affection and discretion coexist at the heart of monarchy. As you leave George V's private circle, you sense a recurring theme: kings whose attachments, whether public or hidden, shaped not just personal lives, but the fabric of governance. Even in a modernizing era, the human heart, loyalty, desire, and secrecy remains a quiet but potent force guiding the corridors of power, subtly bending history along the way. You step into the turbulent reign of Edward VIII, a king whose heart and desires would famously collide with duty and tradition. The year is 1936, and London is buzzing with whispers of abdication, scandal, and social upheaval. You follow him through the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, noticing how charm, elegance, and discretion weave together into the very fabric of his court. Edward moves with a magnetic ease, drawing confidants near him, men whose presence carries more weight than official titles could ever convey. Among these companions, you notice the distinctive figure of a well-dressed courtier in indigo and gold, always close, yet never obtrusive. Scholars still argue whether Edward's relationships with men were purely affectionate, intimate, or intertwined with political and social maneuvering. What is undeniable, however, is the subtle influence they held, guiding decisions, offering solace, and sharing in the complex balance between personal desire and royal responsibility. Oddly, Edward employs elaborate gestures to maintain privacy, hidden letters, coded messages, and careful seating arrangements at court events. Every touch, glance, or gift carries layers of meaning, a language understood by insiders, but invisible to the public eye. Courtiers whisper, speculating on relationships, loyalties, and ambitions, yet the true nature of these bonds remains carefully shielded. Even amid public appearances, Edward's demeanor hints at personal attachments that defy convention. At formal dinners, balls, and royal engagements, he ensures his companions are positioned nearby, subtly communicating favor and trust. Scholars still debate how much these private bonds influenced his decisions, but there is no doubt they shaped the rhythm of daily court life and, at times, the trajectory of political events. You glimpse moments of quiet humanity. Edward walking along palace gardens at dusk, confiding fears, hopes, and frustrations to a trusted companion. The intimacy contrasts sharply with the public spectacle of monarchy, revealing a king navigating the tension between personal truth and institutional expectation. Oddly, small trinkets, rings, miniature portraits, or tokens of affection circulate privately. Symbols of favor and loyalty that speak louder than any proclamation could. You notice the precariousness of such relationships. Favorites rise and fall, their security tied to discretion, loyalty, and the king's favor. Yet through these fragile bonds, Edward seeks comfort and understanding, forging alliances that transcend conventional power structures. Scholars still argue whether these attachments ultimately influenced his abdication or simply offered solace during a period of immense pressure. As night falls, you observe Edward and his companion sharing laughter in private chambers, moments fleeting but loaded with meaning. The corridors of power, rigid and performative by day, yield to warmth, intimacy, and unrecorded influence by night. These hidden dynamics reveal how personal relationships, carefully maintained and discreetly expressed, quietly steer history alongside politics, fashion, and protocol. Even as Edward's story hurtles toward abdication and public controversy, the private bonds linger as enduring threads, a reminder that affection, loyalty, and discretion are forces that quietly shape the monarchy, the court, and ultimately the course of history. You arrive at the twilight of the story, tracing the personal and secretive lives of modern kings, focusing on the subtle echoes of intimacy that persist even in the 20th century. Edward VIII has abdicated, yet the precedent he set, favoring personal desire over duty, reverberates through the monarchy. You wander through the quiet corridors of later palaces, sensing how private bonds, discretion, and loyalty continue to shape the lives of those who wear the crown. George VI, hesitant and duty-bound, inherits a crown heavy with expectation and a world on the brink of war. Scholars still debate how much the shadows of past kings' private attachments informed his own relationships with confidants and advisors. You notice small, intimate gestures, a trusted aide allowed in chambers late at night, a quiet conversation in the library, the subtle reliance on companionship that balances the immense pressures of sovereignty. These relationships, though far less sensational than Edward VIII's, quietly influence decisions, temper anxieties, and guide governance in unseen ways. Oddly, even in the austere years of George VI's reign, coded letters, discreet gifts, and private confidences endure as tools of connection. Courtiers navigate the intricate dance of proximity and discretion, always aware that favor can shape not only social standing, but also political influence. You imagine the thrill and the subtle tension in these private exchanges. A wink, a carefully chosen word, a token of trust, all signaling a bond that exists beneath the surface of public duty. The human element persists in quiet, tender moments. You picture George VI walking in the palace gardens at dusk with a trusted companion, sharing observations, fears, and humor, the weight of history momentarily suspended. Scholars still argue whether such bonds had tangible effects on decisions during crises like World War II, but the evidence of intimate influence remains undeniable. These private connections serve as anchors amid the turbulence of expectation and global responsibility. Oddly, these private relationships also expose vulnerability, the need for trust, the risk of misinterpretation, and the constant tension between personal loyalty and institutional obligation. Each king, in navigating affection and secrecy, demonstrates the enduring complexity of power intertwined with intimacy. The patterns are clear. Love, friendship, and devotion continue to shape courts, influence decisions, and guide the unrecorded narratives of history. As you step back, observing the arc from medieval to modern times, you recognize the continuity. Kings who loved discreetly, companions whose loyalty was as powerful as any title, and the persistent undercurrent of affection steering the monarchy. Even where public perception dominates, the private hearts of monarchs pulse with influence, subtly shaping the kingdom through acts unseen by most of the world. And finally, as you linger in the echoing halls of history, the story of the gay kings of England, their hidden bonds, and the courage to love privately or discreetly leaves a lasting impression. The lessons are clear. History is not only about wars, treaties, or crowns. It is about the human connections that quietly guide decisions, comfort hearts, and persist across centuries, whispering the true story of those who lived behind the gilded walls of monarchy. As the story drifts to a close, you feel the weight of centuries settling softly around you. The candlelight of history flickers in your mind, casting long shadows across gilded halls, moonlit gardens, and quiet chambers where secrets of the heart were carefully kept. You imagine walking slowly through these corridors, footsteps muffled by thick rugs, feeling the echo of laughter, whispered confidences, and the pulse of loyalty that quietly guided the monarchy. The human element lingers in these spaces, the thrill of a hidden glance, the comfort of a trusted companion, the subtle power of affection shaping decisions that would ripple through history. Even as empires rise and fall, these private bonds endure, leaving traces in letters, gifts, and subtle gestures that historians may only guess at. You feel the intimacy of it all. How fragile yet potent these connections were, quietly bending the currents of politics and public expectation. Outside, the world moves on, oblivious to the private dramas behind palace doors. The streets are silent at night, the gardens still under the soft glow of moonlight, and the walls themselves seem to breathe with the memories of love and loyalty carefully preserved. You can almost hear the gentle murmur of conversation, the quiet laughter, the sighs of relief when trust is honored and discretion maintained. As you take a final, slow breath, the story softens into a lullaby of history. The kings, their companions, the courtiers, all remain alive in your imagination, their human hearts beating amid the pomp, ceremony, and weight of crowns. These hidden threads of intimacy remind you that history is never solely about events or power. It is about the quiet, unseen connections that shape lives and nations. So now, relax your shoulders, let your eyes close gently, and picture the candlelight flickering one last time across gilded chambers. Feel the whisper of history settle around you like a soft blanket, and let the stories of affection, loyalty, and courage carry you into the quiet of the night. End of script. Sweet dreams.